Welcome back. I'm your host, Abe Lloyd. This is the Natural History of the Pacific Northwest class. And today we're at the Stimpson Preserve for our Lowland Forest unit. And so we'll be walking through the forest, thinking about disturbance, thinking about the importance of things like coarse woody debris and standing snags and dead wood for wildlife. And of course we'll be learning a lot about the different organisms, plants, and some birds and some salamanders if we get lucky. So the Stimpson Reserve is a neat combination of several different partners. You can see down at the bottom that the Whatcom County Parks, the Whatcom Land Trust, the Washington Department of Natural Resources, and the City of Bellingham all partnered to create the Stimpson Reserve. Most of the land, or at the beginning, it was some land donated by the Stimpson family to form the preserve, and it continues to get bigger almost every year with funds that are coming from the Watershed Acquisition Program that are funding small parcels, usually like 5 to 10 acre parcels around the perimeter that are being acquired. So it's a really great spot to look at some nice big trees bordering on old growth, and we're going to compare some of the forest stand that we see here with an industrial forest and think about differences in structure and composition of the communities. One of my goals in this class is to give you some exposure to some tools that ecologists use for measuring different components of different ecosystems, and today we're going to focus on measuring trees. And I'm going to take you to my house and we're going to measure tree height using a couple different methods. But since I'm here at Stimpson, and Stimpson has some really nice big trees, I just want to get a few measurements of the diameter. This thing is massive! Alright, so the first big Doug fir we came to has a diameter of 162 centimeters, so that's about 5 feet 4 inches roughly. Pretty big. Trees are dominant here in the Pacific Northwest, and understanding some parameters related to the trees is a good way of better understanding what's going on in a forest as it changes over time. So I'm going to go over a few methods for both measuring and estimating the height and age of our lowland trees, or any trees really. Both making exact measurements and pretty good estimates are much easier when the trees are small, like this one here. So I could guess, oh, this is probably 2.5, 3 feet tall, and I could measure it, and not too bad. 2 feet 8 inches was my guess. And let's see, we could do the diameter as well. And I could see the diameter of this tree is 3/4 of an inch. Alright, but things get a lot more complicated when the trees are taller and way taller than me. So let's figure out some methods for estimating and measuring tall trees. Age is similarly easier to estimate on a younger tree than it is on an older tree. And beside me here is a Doug fir tree on my property that I have in jail here to keep it from leaving, to protect it from deer. The deer like to rub their antlers against trees as a way of marking their territory. But anyway, I could make a pretty good estimation of this tree's age by counting the number of whorls of major branches. So the first whorl down here maybe is when it was 1 or 2, and then it grew, and there's another whorl right here for age 3. Then there's some little teeny branches in between, those don't count, but another major whorl branches here for age 4, age 5, and all the way up here probably for year 6. So this bud will burst and grow into a new shoot, or up here as well, for this summer's growth. But again, on bigger trees, we can't really do that because most of the most of the lower branches fall off eventually on a big tree. When they get shaded out, they stop producing needles on shaded branches, and the branches eventually die and fall off, which is a concept called self-pruning, and we'll reflect more on that later. We can get precise information by cutting the tree down, and this is what was done by early foresters because they wanted to cut the trees down anyway. But we could measure the age precisely of a tree by simply counting the rings. So the center of the tree, we have a very teeny ring. Because this is about 4 feet off the ground, that might be year 4 or 5, and then we could count years for each successive annual growth ring out to the end. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 25, 30. Anyway, I've done this and it's about 108 years old. So this was a big tree, and you're probably wondering, why did my professor cut down a big tree on this property? Well, this tree was killed by bark beetles, and I was worried that it was gonna, after it turned into a snag and started falling apart, it might hurt somebody. So I cut this down just last year. Now, so we can get age from looking at a cross-section of the trunk and counting the annual growth rings. And when a tree is laying on the ground, it's a lot easier to measure the height that it used to be with a tape measure. And this one was well over 100 feet tall. I cut the top off, so can't say for sure anymore. But we obviously don't want to cut down every tree that we're trying to get an age and height for. So we need to figure out ways to measure the height of these big trees safely without climbing up them, although that's probably the most accurate way. But we could do this safely from the ground. And I've been carrying around this stick, so the first method I'm going to teach you uses a stick like this. You'll need more than one person to do it, and you'll also need a tape measure. Okay, so I could use this stick here and hold it up in front of the tree, and what I'm going to do is sight from my eye, the base of the stick, to the trunk of the tree, and then without moving the stick, from my eye to the top of the stick to the top of the tree. And I'll move forward or back from the tree until I can line up the top of the tree with the top of the stick and the bottom of the tree with the bottom of the stick. Will you hold the stick off to the side a little bit? There we go. So now I don't want to cut down this tree. It's one of the best ones on my property, but I could get its height by taking this stick I'm holding and rotating it to the ground, keeping the base at the base of the tree, and Katrina will take the tape measure and, moving at a right angle from me, she'll walk until she's in line, until my eyeball and the end of the stick and her are in a line. Okay, stop! There we go. Yeah, that's about right. And then the tape measure will give us the estimated height of the tree. Here's the geometry. You can see the tree here and a line representation of me looking very skinny, and the stick I'm holding. So my eyeball here, I'm sighting along the bottom of the stick to the bottom of the tree, and from my eyeball on the top of the stick to the top of the tree. And then when I lay the stick down, I'm essentially folding the tree into another dimension here and measuring the distance from the base of the tree to that point.
Wingardium Leviosa!
Now, foresters often work alone because it's more time efficient, and they don't always have big open spaces where they could project the top of a tree down at a right angle and have a field assistant measure the distance from the base of the tree to the point. So there's this tool that's called a clinometer that foresters and ecologists use to measure the height of trees. And you'll notice that there is a wheel that's weighted. So when I rotate this up or down, part of that wheel is always pointing in the down direction. And watch as I look through this. So I could sight, there's a little window in here, and I could sight to the bottom of the tree, and then I could sight to the top of a tree. And since that wheel is always pointing down, I'm sighting at a right angle to that, I can get basically angles or percent slopes. And that's what this clinometer, different clinometers do different things, but this clinometer has two scales. The one on the left is angle, so straight up on this reads, to confirm, yep, straight up on this reads 90 degrees, and straight flat reads 0. And the scale on the right is percent slope. So percent slope is rise over run. So at 1 foot out and 1 foot up, that would be a 45-degree angle. So let's line up the scale, 45. And what should the percent slope be?
1 divided by 1
is 1.0, or since this is percent, it's written as 100%. All right, so that's a tool we can use for estimating the height of the tree, but we need one more piece of information. We need to know the distance we are from the tree. So I could do that really easily with a tape measure, and a lot of forestry tapes actually have a spike on the end, so you could hammer it into the bark and then walk backwards, and one person can get a measurement that way. This isn't a forestry tape, but my wife can help me here. So we're gonna estimate the height of this tree using the clinometer and the tape measure. First thing is that I need to get to a place where I can easily see both the bottom of the tree and the top of the tree. And I'm in a good spot here. So I look through the clinometer, reading the right scale, I can, in keeping both eyes open, I get a reading for the bottom of the tree, and it says -5% slope. Okay, now I will get a reading for the top of the tree, and it says positive 125% slope. All right, so we'll hold on to that bit of information while we get a measurement from here to the tree. All right, I am 114 feet from the tree. Now if the tree was leaning out, I would want to measure the point to that's just under the top of the tree. So keep that in mind. All right, we got it. Let's do the geometry now. So I know I was 114 feet from the tree. I know that the angle from my eyeball to the top of the tree was 125 degrees percent, and I know that from my eyeball to the bottom of the tree was -5%. Okay, so now the math. So percent is rise over run, and in order to get a integer percent, we multiply that times 100. So we can take the percent at the top of the tree minus the percent at the bottom of the tree should equal the rise over the run, and we know the run, so we could solve for the rise. So percent to the top of the tree was 125 minus -5%. So that's 130 equals rise, which we're solving for, is h over the run, which was 114 feet. So to solve for h, we simply multiply 114 times 130, and then we have our 100 figure here, and then we divide by 100. So multiplying 114 times 130 is 14,800 equals h times 100 divided by 100. So h, or 148 equals h. Next, we're going to measure the diameter of the tree, and a lot of tree measurements conventions come from forestry, and foresters have a convention of measuring diameter at 4.5 feet above the tree. They call it diameter at breast height because most foresters, their chest is about 4.5 feet off the ground. And this is a convention because the trees often taper a lot. It's called butt flare. They flare down towards the base. And measuring above that butt flare gives you a little more accurate reading for the tree because, some trees have more butt flare than others, and so this is more standard across the trees, is to get above that butt flare. Foresters carry a special type of tape with them, and I have one here we're going to use, and it has two sides to it. So on one side we have distance measurements. This tape happens to be metric, although most foresters use standard, but at Huxley, forest ecologists are going to be taking measurements in metric. So we have meters marked in red and centimeters marked in black. So 0 meters, 10 centimeters. Now the other side of the tape measure has units that look a little bit like inches, but if we read the scale, it says diameter in centimeters and millimeters. So the big ticks are centimeters and the small dashes in between are millimeters. So somebody has gone and done the math. Remember that the relationship between diameter and circumference is the circumference equals the diameter times pi.
I love pie.
So they've just done this math, and now we can wrap this tape measure around the tree and we'll end up with a diameter reading if we're reading from this side and a circumference reading if we're reading from this side. Foresters report the diameter reading. Again, we have a nice hook, so I'll hook that in at 4.5 feet off the ground. Run around this tree, keeping it as straight as possible, and then I line the 0 up here, and I take my measurement 149 and a half. So that's 149 and a half centimeters is the diameter of this tree. So you're probably wondering, how big is that in feet? Well, we know there's 30 centimeters in every foot, so this is about 5 feet in diameter. I feel pretty lucky to have a tree that's nearly 5 feet in diameter on my property. So many of the trees on my property are about 115 years old and about 150 feet tall, as we just saw. That one was 148 feet tall. And some of these seem genuinely quite large, but keep in mind that old growth trees can get much bigger. In fact, more than twice the diameter. And what boggles my mind even more is that they can be twice as tall. I want to measure the DBH of another one of these big old Douglas fir trees. I think this one's bigger than the last one we measured. Yeah, sure enough, 173 and a half centimeters. So let's see, that's getting pretty close to 6 feet in diameter, just shy of 6 feet in diameter. Snags are an important part of a forest that we see mainly in older forest systems. Industrial forests typically don't have a lot of snags in them just because they're not old enough yet. And this is a big old snag, and if you recall from the lecture I presented this snag and log decay class table, and because this doesn't have any living branches, no fine twigs, no branches at all, and it's highly decomposed, I would give this stage 4 decay class. Now, you know, in this natural history class, we're always thinking about species identity and trying to understand the past a bit more, and there are some clues about both here. So look at how this is very blackened and charred. Well, that maybe is an indication that this was killed by a fire. And how about species? What species do we think it is? Well, the fact that this stump does not have a lot of flare at the base. Oh, and look at this. This nice thick piece of bark that's still left over. I think both those are good clues that this is a Douglas fir. Now, there's a lot of dead wood, more charred wood here, around the base of this Douglas fir, and it is very decomposed. And this decomposed wood, it's almost 100% organic matter, and so it doesn't have minerals in it, but it does retain moisture really well. And so a lot of plants will grow in decomposing logs because they act a little bit like sponges and hold moisture into the summer when a lot of shallow soils would dry out. And here is a log, and I could check for the different decay classes it's in, and let's see, there isn't any bark left on it, so it's probably in the class 4 log. When you get to the class 5, which is the last class, most fully decomposed before it's not even present anymore, the log will really integrate with the ground a lot, and instead of being more spherical or cylindrical like a log is, they tend to get more and more ovoid as they decompose. So again, this log is really good habitat for things like wood ferns, and here we actually see a western hemlock growing out of this decaying log. So people sometimes refer to logs like this as nurse logs, or if they're standing, nurse snags or nurse stumps, because they're nurseries for so many different organisms. Another log, this one obviously much more recently down. You'll notice that it still has bark. It even still has branches. The wood is pretty sound. I can't break this wood. And so I would rate this as a decay class probably 2, as opposed to a 4 or 5 for the log we saw before. And you can see these pouch fungus, or sorry, these are bracket fungus or shelf fungus, and they're feeding on the decaying material. And once the wood is fairly decayed, there isn't going to be much left for bracket fungus to feed on. So usually you see these on logs that are in a decay class of 1 to 3, but not beyond that. You guessed it, I'm going to talk about this log here. This is a class 5, decay class 5. You can see how it's very flat. It's mostly, it's like dissolving into the ground, and it's totally covered with moss. Yeah, but still providing a nice nursery for this red huckleberry here. Looks like a pillow. So again, another snag here, probably decay class 7, no bark, broken off at the top, fairly well decomposed. Sometimes you'll see snags like this that have been ripped into by wildlife, or logs laying on the ground that have been shredded by wildlife. Well, there are lots of grubs that grow in these logs, and bears will rip them apart looking for the grubs. Well, many of the snags in this forest stand have jagged tops and indicate that they died of natural causes. Here's one that has a very flat top because it was cut down by humans. So interesting that this stand has both, and what that tells me is that there was just some high-grade timber extraction here where the loggers only took the best trees and left a lot of the other ones. So they took the biggest, straightest Douglas firs and probably left a lot of hemlocks and cedars and trees that were just not very big or not very good for timber. And this one is flat topped, good sign that it was logs. But here is a curious mark. There's this notch cut into it, and this is what's called a springboard notch. So a logger cut a notch here and then stuck a plank of wood in here and stood on the wood, and that enabled them to get high enough to then cut the tree using a handsaw and axes. So when you see the springboard notches, generally that's a sign that that it was logged by hand, not by machines, and is a good clue as to when the tree was cut down. So hand logging was done maybe until the 20s or 30s or something like that. This tree tipped over, but likely it died before it tipped over, and there are a few clues. So one clue is that it doesn't have a lot of fine roots. Likely many of those fine roots died and rotted in the ground, and then there wasn't enough to support the tree anymore, so it tipped over. Now trees also can get blown over by wind, and when they blow over by wind and they're a healthy tree, they'll produce a tip-up mound, it's called, or the root wad will be a lot bigger and it'll have a lot more fine roots on the root wad. So that's a good thing to look for when you're looking at tip-up mounds like this, is the size of the roots at the bottom of the tip-up mound. Look here, the base of the tree looks perfectly healthy, but as we go up, we can see that all of the leaves are gone. 1, 2, 3, 4 trees that are totally dead in this cluster, and panning down, you can see that there's another big snag there. So what's going on that killed all these trees? We can see some pouch fungus growing on some of them. Those little teeny white fungi are called pouch fungus. And over here are some shelf fungus like we saw on the log earlier. So these trees were likely all killed by either some dry weather that we've had, abnormally dry weather that we've had over the last few years, or potentially by a fungus called armillaria or root rot. But they're all recently dead. We can see that the needles or the branches, it still has fine twigs. And here's some cavities that have been chiseled out in the trunk of this snag by a woodpecker, and quite frequently those cavities will later be inhabited by other animals, flying squirrels, ducks, wood ducks especially, and all sorts of passerine birds. All of the big dead trees around us have lost their leaves and are enabling sunlight to reach the forest floor, and this has resulted in a big flush of understory vegetation. We have young western hemlocks growing up, red huckleberries really taking advantage of this nurse log situation. The ferns around me are really lush. So these are characteristics of an old growth forest. We have a multi-layered canopy, so those big trees up above and younger trees down below, and then understory vegetation, and we have a lot of dead standing trees and logs. So even though the oldest trees here are just kind of right at the edge of being considered old growth, Pacific wren calling, ooh, one of the best calls there is. So even though these trees are just kind of at the edge of being considered old growth, the forest is changing to take on some old growth characteristics because of the trees that are dying and opening up the canopy to allow a multi-layered canopy to form. Looking around, I noticed that there is way less understory vegetation than in the area where I was a moment ago. And I could also see that many of these trees are about the same age and younger than the older trees that I was measuring. We're in a different stand, and this stand is in a different stage of succession. A forester would call this the stem exclusion stage. So as the trees are racing upward for light, not all of them are able to win and the losers are dying. But they're competing so fiercely for light that very little light is hitting the understory and there's not enough for very much vegetation. Just a few sword ferns here and a few sword ferns there. Compared to some stands which have more old growth characteristics. So some trees have died and started major canopy trees. The trees that won that race have died and left big holes in the canopy that are allowing light to come in and enable the understory vegetation to flourish. So we got the stem exclusion phase in the trees behind me here. Have you ever seen all these holes in a tree before? Really tight together, sometimes in perfect rows. These are the work of a sapsucker. And our red-breasted sapsucker will drill the holes and a little bit of sap will come out. And they'll lick the sap and they'll also come back and feed on insects that get trapped in the sap. And we don't really see much sap or insects now. This is, there's a little bit of sap here. This is older work. This is a curiosity. This looks like a tree that died or maybe was cut down. But look at how the bark has grown over the top of the stump here. Now, how can a dead tree keep on growing? This was a question that mystified botanists for a long time, and some recent research has really helped us answer this question. So it turns out you've probably heard of mycorrhizal relationships where fungi coat a root and trade, they get sugars from the tree or plant in exchange for the minerals in the soil that they are good at getting from the soil. And that's part of the story here. So even though this tree died, it was actually connected by fungal threads, hyphal threads, through this mycorrhizal association to this tree, the big tree that's next to it. So this big tree was in the same network, a shared mycorrhizal network, as this dead stump. And so it was able to divert some of its sugars to this stump and allow it to keep on growing and to heal over that exposed sapwood and keep the sapwood from leaking water, because potentially it was getting water from that same plumbing, the mycorrhizae. So some people call this root grafting, where the roots of two trees are virtually grafted together because they're part of the same network. And in some cases they actually don't require mycorrhizae. They can actually graft together without that, and in other cases they're just together through a mutual partner. There are a number of different ways to estimate the age of a tree, or even measure the age of a tree. Now, if I had an increment borer, I could use it to drill a hole into this tree and pull out a core and count the annual rings on the tree. Instead, less destructively, I'm going to use this key that has been developed for aging a Douglas fir tree. And just like the dichotomous key, it's actually a little different than the dichotomous keys that we've used for identifying species. This just has a series of questions, and for each positive answer, you get points. So the first one reads, bark condition on the lower 1/3 of the tree. Is it hard, bony bark with small fissures? That would get a point value of 0, and that's not the case. Hard bark with deep fissures, a little closer. Hard bark with charcoal present. I don't actually see any charcoal on this particular tree, but some of the other ones had charcoal. Soft, I would actually call this next, it says soft flaky bark with deep fissures. So this bark is soft enough that I could kind of push my thumb a little bit into parts of it. Because it's so old, it's kind of died. And you could see these deep fissures. So I would give, let's see, that gets a score of 2. The next part on this key talks about the lower 1/3 of the tree again, but now it's talking about knots. So knots are left over from branches. So first it says branch stubs present. If there are branch stubs present on the lower 1/3 of the tree, it would get a score of 0. And I see branch stubs, but they're pretty far up there. I would not say that it's the lower 1/3. Say it's the middle third. Old knot whorl indicators visible. So on a young tree that has recently lost its branches, you'll actually see these little eye-shaped things around the tree. I'll try and get a picture of one of those later. Again, not present on this tree. It's too old to have those. And finally, no knot whorl indicators visible, gets 2 points. And I would agree, so I'm going to assign this a 2-point value for the knot indicators. The last part of the key says lower crown indicators, and the crown of a tree is the top, the canopy essentially. But this is lower crown now because our Douglas fir trees are so tall. Anywhere that has branches with needles on them is considered part of the crown. So the lower crown would be those lowest branches that have needles on them. Okay, so lower crown indicators. Looking up at this tree here, we could see that the lowest branches, there are some low branches with needles on them, and they're very short, and they're forming this spray-like pattern, looking like a fan, and those are actually epicormic branches. Now the way an epicormic branch works is that if you have a trunk and a branch coming out, as trees grow, they're racing for sunlight and they're growing from the top. And this branch that's way down near the bottom, if it doesn't get sunlight anymore, it'll eventually die and it'll fall off. Okay, but there's still some living tissue that extends through the bark where that branch fell off. And if a tree next to it dies and sunlight starts hitting it on the side, it will resprout a new branch. Usually it doesn't just resprout one new branch, it resprouts a whole spray of branches, making a fan pattern. And for Doug firs, at least, we get a fan pattern when there's epicormic branching. So epicormic branching simply means branching that occurs on the surface, the skin surface, the epicorm, as a result of this sunlight hitting the bark process. So up above, we can see some sprays of young branches that are in that fan-like pattern, and they're small, so I would give this a 1 point for small epicormic branches present. So I could total my score for each section. The bark condition, I gave it a score of 2. The knot indicators, I gave it also a score of 2, so that's 4. In the lower crown indicators, I gave it a score of 1 because the small epicormic branches were present, giving me a total of 5. So there's a scoring key on this chart, and it says if it's 4 to 5, it's in maturation 2, which means that the forests are originating before Euro-American settlement 140 to 240 years ago. If it was greater than 5, it would be considered old growth, a stand that's 210 roughly or more years old. So that's one way of measuring the age of the tree here, and kind of by association the stand, if it's one of the biggest trees, without damaging the tree at all, just by characteristics. If you haven't noticed yet, one of the things I really want you to think about in this course, especially related to forests, is light. Why is there more light in some areas than others? We've talked about tree height and stem exclusion. Well, water can also be a big reason why trees may or may not be found. And here along this corridor, on either side of me, standing that way, is a big band of light that's hitting the forest floor. Now why? Well, in this case, it's because there's a little creek running along beside me, and the soils around me are actually too saturated for trees to grow in. Trees don't like having their roots permanently wet. They can't do any gas exchange and they'll die. So this is a fairly wet forest. The trees that are closer to the water are going to be cedars, and we have some plants like salmonberry, which you learned already, skunk cabbage, and some others, which I'm going to be teaching you on our walk out of the Stimpson, that like growing in wet sites. But as we go out, I'm going to teach you, we'll see a variety of forest types and how they're associated with different moistures, different exposures, like a southern exposure versus a northern exposure, and different amounts of light, and we could compare the understory. You know, in the early spring, you have to start to learn things before they leaf out. That's just the challenge we have with this class, but this one is the most identifying characteristic of this are the spines. This is Devil's Club. I guess it's called that because it looks like a walking stick or a club, and it's just loaded with these super sharp spines. And some people actually, when they get pricked by them, they'll have a pretty bad reaction, kind of like an allergic reaction. Now, Devil's Club tends to like rich forest understories, often with a little bit more moisture, as we see next to the creek here. And it's sometimes called Alaskan ginseng because it is thought to contain some medicinal properties similar to ginseng. I don't know that there's been a lot of scientific research done on this plant, but it is traditionally used and still used a lot today by Native Americans and First Nations in Canada for treating things like high blood pressure and heart disease and just a wide array of ailments, as well as sometimes being used as a charm placed above the door as a peeled, and the stem placed above the door as a means of keeping evil spirits out of the house. So this is the Devil's Club, a quite small one, and there's some bigger ones around me. And later in the year, it'll have a leaf that gets to be about that large and looks a lot like a maple leaf, big leaf maple leaf, except that it has spines, just like these spines, along the veins of the leaf on the underside. I mentioned this plant in passing. This is the wood fern, and it usually is growing out of wood. Like this log here, usually pretty soft wood. It's so soft. And some characteristics of the wood fern. It's one that overwinters generally pretty well. It has these fronds that were pressed down by snow and will die as the new fronds come up, but usually during the winter you could find some green bits left over. It's a fern that grows out of a clump, unlike the bracken fern, which grows along a line. This one grows out of a clump. And if I pick one of the fronds here, it generally has a triangular outline. So if I go up the base of this leaf stem here, the frond, the first branch I come to, the leaflet really, or pinnae, is going to be the longest. Okay, compare that to the lady fern, which I'll show you in a second, where the first pinnae or branch that I come to is going to be one of the shorter ones, and the longest one is in the middle of the frond. So this is wood fern, and it produces a little fiddlehead that is edible, but it's not all that delicious. They tend to be pretty hairy. You could see all the scales along the leaf, the base of the frond. So you can eat it if you want. I recommend boiling it if you do, and rubbing off as many of those hairs and young leaves as possible before eating it. Another fern that has some similar characteristics to the wood fern is the lady fern. So here's lady fern. Generally you find lady fern growing in slightly wetter soils. It also grows in a clump. There's actually two right here, but you can see how all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and more are emerging. 6 fronds are coming out of one base. But unlike the wood fern, the lady fern, these are last year's fronds. You can see they died in the fall. They didn't stay green all winter long. You could see that the fiddleheads are a little bigger and tighter. And then as the fronds emerge, Here's a full frond, almost fully developed frond. The biggest branch or pinnae on the frond is at the middle of the stalk rather than at the base. So it looks a little bit like a football. It's more elliptical. It's shapely, but it still has these hairy scales. So I find the lady fern to be a little bit better tasting as a fiddlehead than the wood fern, but it still is not as good as the fiddlehead that maybe you've heard of, which is native to the northeastern woodlands. And that fiddlehead doesn't have any of this hairiness, and it doesn't start growing leaves inside of the fiddle, and the leaves taste really bad. So if I were going to eat this fiddlehead, what I would do is strip off, kind of unfurl it and strip off as many leaves as I could. There. And then boil it and eat it, and it would taste a little better. A tree I want you to learn, kind of a shrubby tree, is vine maple. I guess I should call it a viney tree. And here's one. It's just about to start leafing out. You can see the buds have gotten really big. They'll burst soon. And like all, or almost all maples, it has opposite branching and opposite leaves. So we could see right now the opposite branching, where everywhere there's a branch, basically, we have two branches that spread. So there's no alternate pattern on this. And the greenness of the bark is a good character of the vine maple. They're also very, very flexible, and are used in basket weaving today by many Native Americans to form the top hoop. Traditionally, they're used for making snowshoes, and maybe they still are today. I haven't met anybody that makes snowshoes out of vine maple anymore. But it's a really good hardwood. Oh, sometimes also used traditionally for making bows. But when I was a kid, my favorite thing to do, one of my favorite things to do, was to climb up a vine maple tree that was about this big in diameter and bend it over to the ground. And then I could jump, and it acted like a giant spring, and I could jump like 6 or 8 feet off the ground, and then it would bend back down. And I never had one break on. I never had a vine maple break on me, but I've had some other trees break on me when trying to do that. So that's the vine maple. Oh, the maple leaves, they have more points than a big leaf maple, so you could actually spell the name vine maple, V-I-N-E-M-A-P-L-E. Yeah, so they must have 9 lobes on the maple leaf, as opposed to big leaf maple, which usually has more like 5. A rich woodland plant I want you to learn is this one here called baneberry. The leaves are emerging now, and later in the year it'll have a white flower which will produce red berries. And it's called baneberry. Bane means terrible or awful. And the berries are poisonous. One of our most poisonous species of fruit. So don't eat them. As few as 13 berries evidently can do you in. But from personal experience, I can tell you that they taste terrible. You would never want to eat them. They kind of burn your mouth when you stick them in your mouth. Don't try that at home, though. One of our most beautiful spring wildflowers, in my opinion, is the western trillium here. See how big those petals are. This used to be placed in the lily family, and lilies typically have flower parts in 6s, or in this case 3s. It has 3 petals, but you can see that there are 6 yellow anthers there, which produce the pollen. Now, and then it has 3 leaves as well. Trillium is a plant that has a cool relationship with ants. When it goes to seed, the seeds actually have this protein-rich structure on the side of the seed called an elaiosome, and when ants will gather the seed and take the elaiosome and eat it, and they'll disperse and distribute the seeds. Here is an orchid. Now our orchids aren't as showy as the orchids you see in floral stores, but this is an orchid called rattlesnake plantain. I don't know why they call it plantain. I guess plantain is a name that's used for a variety of different families and plants, but this is in the orchid family, not the plantain family. But note how the leaf has kind of a lizard skin look to it, or snake skin. I guess that's why they call it rattlesnake plantain. And it's fairly shade tolerant orchid. So along this slope we see it's just dominated by sword ferns in the understory, and we're on the north slope of a little hill here, and it's fairly shady, and sword ferns are pretty shade tolerant, and they usually like kind of middle moisture soils, so they're not growing in the wettest spots and they're not growing in the driest spots. And on a north slope like this, it's a good place for not being the driest spot, because there's not as much evapotranspiration on a north slope, because the sun is largely coming more from the south, not from the north. So now I'm on the top of the little ridge here, and the soils are drier, and instead of it being dominated by the sword fern that we saw more on the north side, now we have a lot of Oregon grape. And Oregon grapes tolerate drier sites better, and so we tend to see them at the tops of hills and on the southern and southwestern aspects of hills, especially, because there's a lot more radiative stress or evapotranspiration drying out the soils on those aspects. Here is a little plant called vanilla leaf, and it has 3 leaves, sort of like trillium, but you'll notice that the leaves don't come to a point. They kind of look a little bit like moose antlers on the end, multiple points rather. And contrary to the name, it doesn't produce any vanilla-like qualities. When I was young, I picked a bunch thinking that I could use it as a vanilla substitute or something, and put it in my car and was driving home to experiment with it, and suddenly my throat choked up and I got all started coughing, and turned out that this plant is traditionally used as an insecticide because it has all these volatile oils that come out of the leaf as they dry and choke up the insects just like it was choking me up. So I had to park the car on the side of the road and jettison all the leaves I had, and then I could continue driving safely. Here is a salal. Again, we saw this on the shoreline near Larrabee State Park. And salal is amazingly shade tolerant. I'm in this thick forest here at the Stimpson Reserve. It's never going to produce any berries here, but it can persist in the shade. And it handles dry sites really well. That's one reason why we see it right along the shorelines. And here, the microtopography, I'm at the very top of a little ridge, and this is the little knoll on the top of that ridge. So the only water it's getting essentially is what rains down on it. It's not going to have any groundwater supporting it, because usually groundwater, like everything else, goes down with gravity. Here is what's kind of become a more unusual understory tree called Pacific Yew. And you'll notice that the needles kind of point out just in 2 directions on the twig here. They're pointy on the tip, kind of light green on the bottom and dark green on the top. And this tree actually produces a red berry instead of a cone, even though it's an evergreen. So this is the Pacific Yew, and it never gets super tall. It'll top out at about maybe 20 or 30 feet. But the wood is amazingly strong. It's one of our densest softwoods, or densest evergreen trees. And so dense that traditionally Native Americans would carve chisels out of or wedges out of the wood and use yew wood for splitting softer woods like cedar into planks, and chunking out blocks of wood from canoes using these wedges. And again, it's another great bow wood material. And in a number of the Salish languages, the name for this plant translates simply as bow plant. So here we have a plant that loves growing in wet soils. It's an obligate wetland plant. It only grows in wetlands. And it's called skunk cabbage because of its smell. Smells like a skunk and looks superficially like cabbage, but not surprisingly it's not closely related to a skunk and only very distantly related to a cabbage. And the skunk cabbage is in a unique family of plants that all have this flower structure called a spathe and a spadix. So the spathe is this kind of dish-shaped petal, just one single petal, and the spadix is the spike that has all the floral parts on it. So here we can see the spathe, the petal part. It's yellow, like many petals. It's distinct, and the spadix that has pollen, and maybe I can get some pollen to come out. Well, you can see pollen has dusted the leaves around it. The leaves will actually grow quite tall, and they are a little bit like banana leaves and used for a lot of things in similar ways that banana leaves are traditionally used. Here in the Salish Sea area, people cover cooking pits with the leaves to keep the heat and the steam inside the cooking pit. Or if you need to wrap up some food, you could just wrap it in a leaf and stuff it under the coals to cook. And sometimes people call it Indian wax paper because it's used for setting things on like you would wax paper. And the leaf bases are reportedly edible. I've experimented with them, and I recommend a lot of caution because they contain a crystal that can embed in your mucous tissues and irritate your mouth. I had a sore in my mouth for a week after an older scout encouraged me to eat some skunk cabbage, which was a bad idea. But if you cook them properly, they are edible. This week I'm going to ask you to learn a few mosses, and here's one that I think is a pretty easy moss to learn. All the leaves are kind of clumped together in these long shapes that look a little bit like worms. This is called wavy-leafed cotton moss. Commonly grows on well-decomposed logs and on the ground at the base of trees. You might be a little intimidated by mosses, but if you learn just a half dozen mosses, you can go a long way, and let me tell you, you'll really impress your friends when you start pointing out mosses to them. This is another one of our very common mosses, and it's called Menzies tree moss. And I'll show you why. If you pull out one of the mosses, it looks like a little tree. Another rich woodland plant commonly found under western hemlocks and sometimes Douglas firs is this here. It's called Siberian miner's lettuce. We actually have two different types of miner's lettuce, and like the name suggests, they're edible, but I prefer the one that is just called miner's lettuce, not called Siberian miner's lettuce. And you can see that this has two leaves on the flowering stem, whereas the better tasting miner's lettuce just has a single leaf with the flowering stem perforating through the end of that leaf. Another ground cover here that I want you to learn is called false lily of the valley, and it is in the lily family. And another plant family character of lilies is that the veins are parallel, so they start at the base of the leaf and they go all the way to the tip of the leaf, as opposed to like branching veination where a vein might start halfway up and have a branching pattern rather than this single vein pattern that extends for the whole length of the leaf. And these have sort of a heart-shaped leaf, which in your book it might describe them as being cordate. Cordate simply means heart-shaped. So false lily of the valley, it'll have a nice white flower that'll come out in about 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Another fern is the deer fern here. And deer fern superficially looks a little bit like the sword fern that's next to it. Both originate from clumps. They all come out of, all the fronds come out of a clump at the base. But the deer fern is attached along the whole length of the pinnae, and recall how the sword fern is attached at just one point. And deer fern is usually, I don't know, a brighter green. Now, deer fern is one that I typically see in areas that get more than 40 or 50 inches of rain every year. And you know, even though Bellingham averages 34 inches of rain, and we're pretty close to Bellingham, we're actually close to some mountains that are catching the rain and forcing more precipitation. So the end of, near Lake Whatcom, there's an average of between 45 and 55 inches of rain. I think one of our easiest mosses is this here. And you know, this is such a robust moss, it almost looks like a little fern. This is called stair-step moss, and it is called stair-step moss because it has these little platforms, and every year it grows a new stair-step. This little ground cover is called twin flower because it has the daintiest little pair of pink little flowers. And it, I think one notable feature of the twin flower is that it's named after the famous botanist Carl Linnaeus, who invented our system of binomial nomenclature, where we have a genus and a species squished together to make the scientific name. So this one is Linnea borealis. Okay, I think we're getting near the end of the list of plants I want you to learn. And here's one with a pretty pink flower that's called bleeding heart. And this plant flowers like Trillium. It flowers pretty early in the spring and leaves out early in the spring, and often grows underneath hardwood trees like this red alder or big leaf maple. And it is able to flower and leaf out and flower before the alder trees' leaves get full size and start creating a lot of shade. So this is a type of plant that we call a spring ephemeral because they're short-lived, which is ephemeral, and they do most of their business in the spring. I'm now on the other side of Lake Whatcom in an industrial forest, and we're going to do some comparisons between this industrial forest and what we saw at the Stimpson Reserve, which is a fairly intact stand developing old growth characteristics. So let's look around. Some things that we might notice: there aren't any large trees. All the big trees have been cut, and this forest has largely been replanted with Douglas firs and some hemlocks, and there are a lot of these deciduous or hardwood trees sprouting up around me as well. And in many industrial forests, they actually spray herbicides to kill the alder and the cottonwood and the willows. And that enables the commercially valuable species like Douglas fir to grow even faster. But we're in the Lake Whatcom watershed, and they actually restrict the use of herbicide treatments in the watershed. I'm going to go through this key to stand development stages, and we'll take a look at how you can evaluate what kind of forest stand you're in using this key. So it starts out like a dichotomous key with a couplet of options. One gives A and B, and so we have to choose 1A or 1B. So 1A says cut stumps present throughout the stand. And I can see that there are cut stumps. There's one here. Here's another one here. So there are definitely cut stumps present throughout the stand. 1B says no cut stumps, so I can choose 1A. And that takes me over to 2. So now the second couplet, I compare 2A to 2B. Stumps cut by chainsaw, short stumps, planted seedlings, versus stumps cut stumps cut by hand, tall stumps, springboard notches naturally receded. And we saw those springboard notches at the Stimpson Preserve. And the stumps were much taller. So anyway, we see short stumps, good indication. Look at this stump is very short, actually so short that a person using a chainsaw, it would be uncomfortably short for them to cut. So this was actually cut with a mechanical harvester that grabs the tree low to the ground. It's a big old machine, grabs the tree, a saw cuts it while it's holding it, and then the harvester can set the tree down wherever it wants. It's called a buncher feller. And then wheels in the gripper thing turn and zip the tree through the gripper thing, and there are little saws that cut off all the limbs as it zips through. Seems like something out of Fern Gully, but that's the way mechanized forestry is today. I always use movie references that are 20 years old. I don't know if you've seen Fern Gully or not, but it's a cartoon that you maybe want to check out. Okay, so we can choose 2A, stumps cut by chainsaw. All right. 3A, legacy trees. Trees considerably older, larger than the others. Present. Or 3B, no legacy trees. So I look up, there aren't any big trees here. So there aren't any legacy trees. 3B says go to 6. The 6th couplet goes 6A, Douglas fir, live or dead, greater or equal to 25% of the main canopy stems, or 6B, Douglas firs, less than 25% of the main canopy stems. And these, I would say, the Douglas fir trees are about 40% of the developing canopy. It's a pretty young forest stand here. So then 6A tells me to go to 7. And 7, instead of just having 2 options like the typical key, 7 actually gives me 7A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Not a great practice for most keys, but it works out fine for this key. 7A says young planted Douglas fir trees less than 10 years old. That would be the cohort establishment phase. 7B would be young planted Douglas fir trees 5 to 20 years old, abundant shrub cover. That would be the canopy closure. And so on. I'm not going to get through all of these. So let's try and figure out the age of this little Douglas fir tree. Remember, we could count the major whorls of branches, and it's kind of hard to tell where year 1 and 2 are, but let's just say this is probably year 3. This would be year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7. Oh, year 8 was a big year. Year 9, so this is just about 10 years old. So is it less than 10 or is it 5 to 20? Hard to say. But the 7B says abundant shrub cover, and there is abundant shrub cover, so I would go with 7B, the first part of this canopy closure stage. So real soon now, these trees are going to start forming a canopy that's starting to shade out the understory shrubs. Industrial forests are often characterized by blocks of cutting in different age stands. So I'm just 200 yards from where I was earlier, and now I'm in a stand of forest that is obviously older. We're going to go through the stand age key and see if we could figure out just about how old they are. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of this forest related to the light that hits the forest floor and the diversity. Okay, so cut stumps present throughout the stand. Yes. And the stumps were cut by chainsaw, yes, so we go to 3. 3A legacy trees, which would be bigger trees, usually above the canopy, usually significantly taller or significantly bigger. Present, no legacy trees, so 3B takes us to 6. 6 is the Douglas fir, greater than 25% of the main canopy or less than 25%. It is greater than, so that says to go to 7. All right, so 7 is where I spent a lot of time last time, and we know that they're obviously not less than 10 years old. Young planted Douglas fir trees, 5 to 20 years old, abundant shrub cover. Okay, if I look around here, I could see that basically there are large patches of hardly any vegetation, and where there is vegetation, it's mostly sword ferns. So not shrub cover, mainly fern cover. So I'll go down a little further. 7C, Douglas fir trees, not yet overhead, overlapping crowns, shrubs present. Okay, they're overhead. 7D, Douglas fir canopy overhead, self-pruning, scant understory. That's starting to sound just like what we have. So I use that term self-pruning a little bit when we were at the Stimpson. And this is a good example of self-pruning here. So these limbs used to have, they used to be living limbs with needles and everything, but as the tree got taller, they got shaded and the tree just aborted the growth to the limb. And they died, and as they die, they eventually break off. Maybe when birds try and land on them, or maybe just with time and wind, and that's the process of self-pruning. So this tells us then that we are in the biomass accumulation / stem exclusion stage. So that means that the trees are growing at peak rate. They're accumulating biomass faster than they will at any other time in their life. And so they should be getting taller, faster, and they're getting wider faster. And if you cut down a tree, or if you look at a stump that is in the biomass accumulation stage, or a stump that is much older, you can see that the growth rings are biggest between about the ages of 10 and 60 or so, because it's growing the fastest at that point. Now, another thing that should happen during the biomass accumulation / stem exclusion stage is that there will be winners and losers. The trees have been planted pretty close together, and some of them aren't going to make it. In this case, since it's an industrial forest, they actually do pre-commercial thinning. So people come through and they cut down some of the trees that are too close together to thin them out. And we'll pause a second, I'll show you some signs of that pre-commercial thinning. So little stumps like this is a sign of the pre-commercial thinning. And this stump is already pretty rotten, and the smaller the wood is, the faster it's going to rot. So really big legacy stumps can last for hundreds of years because they have a lot of heartwood, and heartwood is really decay resistant. But little stumps like this are mainly sapwood, and they're small diameter and they rot really quickly. So I think this was pre-commercially thinned just 5 or 6 years ago, but many of the old stumps from the pre-commercial thinning have already been so rotten that you can't see them. For quick contrast, here's a stump that has been here for a long time. This may have even been hand logged 100 years ago. And it's still here because it's so much bigger, it's going to take longer to rot, and there's proportionally a lot more heartwood that is decay resistant. So I pointed out some Doug fir stumps at the Stimpson. This is a cedar stump, and you can see there's more flare at the bottom, and also cedar trees tend to have what are called buttressed roots. So here was a root, and it creates this bump or buttress at the base of the stump, and that's a great way of identifying both cedar stumps, and when you're cruising through the woods and you can't see the branches because they're too high up, you could identify a cedar by its bark features and its buttressed stump. More signs of stem exclusion here. This one probably not cut down by the foresters as part of their thinning practices, but it's still on the ground. I think it was excluded from the canopy just a few years ago, judging by how many fine twigs there are. It still has bark and all that. So we have a little bit of dead wood in this commercial forest, but you could see that the logs that are on the ground and the few snags that are here are much finer. After the canopy closes and the trees move into what we see here, the biomass accumulation phase, the understory is really scant. And for many organisms, forest organisms, like deer and bear and all sorts of other organisms, this is a difficult time. These are kind of like shade deserts, so to speak. There's very little diversity here. Difficult for plants too. But as the tree continues to age, more and more, if it's not logged, it's more likely that some trees will die and the canopy will start to break up, and we'll get a little bit more diversity in canopy height. So this has actually happened right over here. So one of these trees died, or maybe was thrown over by a windstorm, and we can see how much more lush the understory is as a result of that big hole in the canopy. Can you see that big hole in the canopy? Okay. Yeah. So we have not only more sword ferns in this zone, but there's also some other tree species. Probably can't see them on film very well, but I see bitter cherries that are poking up, some ocean spray, western hemlock growing out of a stump. So there's just a lot more diversity taking advantage of this naturally produced hole in the canopy. Now, we often think of trees dying as a bad thing, but as we can see here, natural processes that drive tree mortality, like wind throw and bark beetles killing a tree here and there, are really important because they provide some variation in the stand. Large uniform stands of the same age trees that persist for a long time pose some problems to wildlife. But when the forest has a lot of different pockets of characteristics, that generally is a little bit better for wildlife. At the Stimpson, we went through key for aging Douglas fir trees, and I wanted to do that here as well because we can compare some of the bark features. So remember, the first part of that key was bark condition, lower 1/3 of the tree. Hard bony bark with small fissures. This is hard bony bark with small fissures. So it would get a score of 0. If it was hard bark with deep fissures, it would get a score of 1, but these are quite small. Okay, then for knot indicators, lower 1/3 of the tree, branch stubs present. So these are branch stubs. So it would get a 0 for that as well. Next below that it says old knot whorl indicators visible, and this is an old knot indicator. So you see this black kind of circle. There used to be a branch coming out of here. The branch self-pruned, and the bark has started to heal around it a bit. But if the tree was old enough that the bark had healed over that knot indicator completely, we would go no knot whorl indicators visible, and it would have gotten 2 points. In any case, it gets either 0 or 1 point. Probably 0 because there are still some of these branch stubs present. And then lower crown indicators, are there epicormic branches on these trees? No, because remember, an epicormic branch would form if one of these not indicator spots receives sun again and new branches started sprouting out from that. So there are no epicormic branches, so that also gets a 0. So our total score is less than 2, which means that it's in the biomass accumulation or stem exclusion phase. I want to close with a few reflections on what we've learned in this unit so far. So in lecture, I discussed how forest succession involves a number of different stages. We have a pioneer community, usually grassy plants and annuals, some perennials, and a cereal community, which is usually made up of woody plants and trees, and then an old growth or climax community that's made up more of shade tolerant species, trees. Well, during the field trip, this field trip, we've seen how the cereal community can look quite different at different points. So in the industrial forest that we saw moments ago, the trees were really young, and going through the key, we saw that was called a cohort establishment phase. So the young trees were all established at the same time. That's what a cohort is. As those trees get taller, they form a canopy. So next we have the canopy closure phase. And here we are in this stand where we're getting the next phase is the stem exclusion and biomass accumulation phase. And most commercial forests are managed to be cut at the end really of or kind of peak of the biomass accumulation. So when the biomass accumulation rates are the highest, they cut the trees so that they can start the cycle over again. Now, after that, the trees will mature, and as we saw at the Stimpson, many of those stands are in a maturation phase. So that means the trees are about as big as they're going to get, and a lot of them are starting to die. And we're starting to get some recruitment of other species, shade-tolerant species, in the understory. Now, many of those trees that are recruited in the understory won't grow very well until enough of the big trees die that more light can start to hit the understory. And the final stage then is the vertical diversification stage. And that's when we started to see some of those, there were a few stands at the Stimpson like this, where we saw some of those hemlock trees that were getting to be sapling size, taller than me, with trunks, between maybe that big and about like that big. And then that's where it's transitioning into a climax community or an old growth community. So remember, the old growth community needs to have multi-layered canopies, and we also see this change in dead wood. So in the industrial forest, all the dead wood was still very hard. The stumps were pretty hard just after it was cut. Here in the biomass accumulation stage, a lot of the small stumps are rotten away, and there just isn't very much dead wood on the ground, and what is on the ground is small diameter stuff. Whereas when we're in that maturation phase, we see a lot of big wood, and especially in the climax community, the old growth phase, big snags present, providing a tremendous amount of habitat for all sorts of organisms that burrow into the wood or live under the logs or live between the bark and the wood. So as we go through this growth and decay of trees in a community, light is tremendously affected. And here in the biomass accumulation stage, the ground sees the least light of any stage that the community will go through. And most of our forested lands are managed for this stage, and so that means they're not providing a lot of habitat for ground-dwelling plants and animals. So that's, I think, something to to stew on, like if we're really managing forests, what are our goals for managing forests? Are we managing them for revenue and timber production? Obviously, yes. If we also want to try and manage them for some habitat or more habitat, then maybe we should be letting them grow a little bit longer to provide some of the understory habitat for organisms like bear and deer and things like that.